Hello, thank you for joining Champion Briefs for our 2024 Nationals Topic Analysis video. I'm Daniel Shatzkin, the editor-in-chief of Champion Briefs Lincoln Douglas Debate Products. Today we'll be talking about the topic resolved. In a democracy, a people ought to have the right to secede from their government. First, let's get some thoughts on nationals itself. One of the most important things that you should try to do while at nationals is have balanced cases. You should try to have one or two cases on each side of the topic that can have multiple advantages that you can switch in that make them more or less progressive, easier to understand, or more complicated. This strategy allows you to adapt to judges from across the country and to debaters that use a variety of different styles within their own cases. Moreover, it's important for you to use interesting topics within traditional case structures. Judges at nationals tend to expect traditional structures, so utilitarianism, autonomy, democracy, those general frameworks are where you're going to try to want to steer your cases. But you can use interesting topics within those cases if you want. For example, you can talk about anti-colonial movements and self-determination under this topic. You can look at very interesting issues with minority peoples and the rights that they're trying to achieve for themselves. So just try to find an interesting lens within a traditional framework to look at the topic. And that's usually the best strategies. Those are the ones that have the most success. And then finally, just embrace the idea that you're going to be hearing arguments from different people from different regions that have very different opinions on democracy, freedom, and rights within democracies. At this tournament, you're going to be debating in front of a very diverse audience and population. And so it'll just be important for you to keep everything one as understandable as possible, but then also as interesting as you can possibly make it. Next, let's talk about some definitions in this topic. First, what is secession? Well, secession in its most basic form is the formal withdrawal from a national government. There is also conversation about whether or not secession includes withdrawal from state governments. So, for example, if a portion of the state wants to leave the state but still stay within the national organization. So, like if South Florida wants to leave North Florida but still stay within the United States, or if Western Washington and Eastern Washington decide to split up and Eastern Washington goes and joins Idaho. Those would be somewhat like secessionist movements, and the literature is debatable on whether or not those are secessionist movements or not. Then there's another form of secessionist movement that is also considered anti-colonial nationalism. One author, Julian Go, has decided that these are similar but distinct movements, and that there are actually three different types of similar but distinct movements, and that in secession, nationalism, and anti-colonial nationalism. Anti-colonial nationalism, according to Go, is when a people in colonies want to become independent nations, and it's the first expression of nationalism. So that would be like the American Revolution. There was not a concept of America pre-revolution. There was a concept of the Iroquois Nation and, the Seminole Nation and different native groups that formed tribal confederacies and nations in their own, but there wasn't an idea of an America before that. So the American Revolution is an expression of anti-colonial nationalism, and movements in nations in which there wasn't a form of nationalism prior to colonialism fit under this category, according to Julian Go. Secessionist movements are when part of a country wants to break away from its own nation. So, for instance, that would be like America in the Civil War when the South wanted to break away from its own nation. And then you can also say, like in Scotland with the Scottish National Party and wanting to break away from Great Britain. But even there's a contention over whether or not it's anti-colonial nationalism or a secessionist movement, because technically Scotland and the UK were separate entities. Scotland had a prior distinct nationalist expression prior to it joining into the United Kingdom, and a would this be considered an anti-colonial or an anti-monarchical nationalist movement? I don't know. The same thing happens for a lot of European territories, right? The Catalonian movement would be would that be considered anti-monarchical because the Catalan crown was joined with Aragon, and that became basically the Spain that we know today, with Castile, and we have all of these joinings of different crowns that created our modern nationalist expression. What about in Germany, right? Where Germany was the papal states functionally, or actually, I'm sorry, they were the Germanic states. The papal states were how Italy formed, and they were all separate independent states that formed, into Italy under one leader. Same thing in Germany. They formed as they were independent states led by princes and, electorates and stuff like that. And they had different electors and princes and, monarchs in their regions, and they joined together under one monarch and formed the unified German people. Very oversimplification of it, but still, how do these movements fit into the anti-colonial versus secessionist movements? If one of those groups, like say the Catalans, want to leave Spain, or the Basques who want to, there's a Basque independence movement in both Spain and France. The Northern Irish people, who at different times there have been, fights between the Catholic and Protestant populations, with the Protestants wanting to stay part of Great Britain and the Catholics wanting to join the Republic of Ireland. And that's where you get the troubles and, decades and decades and decades of political violence. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that these definitions are not clear. They are not specific. There is a lot of debate over what would qualify for an anti-colonial nationalist movement versus a secessionist movement. And then there's the third movement of nationalism without states. For example, in Quebec and Puerto Rico, there are many people who express a national ideology and a national image, right? Many Puerto Rican people say they are Puerto Ricans. They're also Americans, but they express Puerto Rican nationalism first. And they don't want to necessarily leave America. Many of them would actually like to become a full state. Many also would like to leave. There's a debate within Puerto Rico about that, similar to in Quebec, where French Canadians identify as French Canadian. They see themselves as a separate identity within the nation, but still within the nation. Ultimately, this gets down to there are a lot of gray areas within secession. Secession itself and those three kind of interpretations provided by Go are one way, but then there's also whether or not partition is secession, federalism is secession, how we would work on those things, how they fit into the topic. That opens the area for counterplans and theory. Uh, Moreover, a people is also a really vague term. Generally speaking, Collins provides the definition that the entire body of persons who constitute a community, tribe, nation, or other group by virtue of common culture, history, or religion, or the like. They use people of Australia or the Jewish people of as an example. The people of Australia is a good one because it's all encompassing. It includes both the Aboriginal Australians and later colonial settlers. But if Aboriginal Australians, the native Australian people, wanted to, uh, you know, promote their own identity and express nationhood, How do they do it? Where would they find their way to do it? Well, there's a common culture within those people. There's a common history. Many probably share a common religion or practices. There is something that connects them together. But those connections can exist across borders too. We can define this geographically, right? I can say the people of Australia because there's a geographical border for Australia, and that common shared geography is where they're all from. But then I can also say the Kurdish people, right? And the Kurdish people can exist within, at least Iraq, Syria. There are some in regions of Turkey. And so the Kurdish people exist outside of our regional borders. And how do we then let, function with that within the topic? There's also culturally, there are people who you can define based on religion. You can define people based on, what governments they look towards. Whether or not I can define myself as both a resident of the city of Westminster, a person in the state of Colorado, or an American. I am a Westminster citizen, a resident of Adams County. I can name through all of these different ways that I can technically identify and how it makes us where I can culturally connect to the people around me within all of those identities. And you can do that yourself within your own identity, even in your own cultural histories, and trace things back. And you can find that if you really want to, you can make really minuscule divides based on the form of a people, in which a people can be defined by like a specific neighborhood within a specific city, within a specific state, in the region, in the state. And each one of those can be defined down further and further. And so a people is a really hard thing to define. And what level of a people then gets to express nationalism kind of starts to feel really arbitrary at some point. What defines the Basque people versus, a subsegment of the Basque people? What it would be the French Basque people versus the Spanish Basque populations. And they may share certain cultural ties, but they also don't share other ones just because they exist in two different governments, or under two different governments. So a people becomes very difficult to define geographically, politically, and culturally, which means that the topic is going to have a lot of vagaries in it, in which you're going to maybe have to prove that the movement, if you're going to talk about a specific movement, about why that movement is really one of national expression from a people and not just a small subsegment group that really is not representative of a people. For instance, is a Texas secession movement as it exists now a limited with limited support the definition of a people, or do they have to reach a majority of the population? If 51% of Texans support Texas secession, does that mean a people supports secession? I don't know. Maybe it needs to be 60 or 75. But what happens with the minority of those peoples? Are they no longer part of that people? If 49% of Texans don't support Texas secession, are they no longer Texans? I don't know. And this is where these areas start to become really interesting. What happens to the rights of that minority population during secession? If Puerto Rico decides to secede as completely from the United States and cut all territorial connections to the United States, but there's still like, a large number of Puerto Ricans who want to be Americans, what obligation does the United States have to those citizens who are still wanting to be American citizens and not go on their own, in a separate way? Same thing in Texas or California or with the Catalans and, or Basque people or the Scottish people. What about those people that don't want to leave the national body? Where are their rights in this process? How are their rights ultimately protected? Some would say that that's what makes the wars in these things inevitable, or conflict somewhat inevitable, unless there is a democratically engaged process which protects the rights of the minority through secession. And that's where we're going to go into next, which is kind of some case ideas and some frameworks. And we're going to start with democracy. Ideal theorists like John Rawls probably would tell you that democracy under its ideal form would never need secession because democracy under its ideal would always protect the minority rights and the minority expression, and there would never be a need to have a secessionist movement. Reality tells us something different. Reality says, one, secession is a real thing. We wouldn't have had a vote in Scotland for secession a few years ago if it wasn't. So democracy does apparently support secession rights in the reality. This is also a way for affirmatives to kind of win that presumption debate. You're going to presume F because democracies have allowed for secession in the past. Just because some don't doesn't mean others do. Or rather, just because some do, though, doesn't mean others don't. But you still would presume on the affirmative because democracies, in some level, do allow for secession. This is also kind of a key area in the debate where what right within a democracy guarantees secession? Well, when we talk about voting and free association as being kind of key parts of democracy, if I don't want to participate within a government, free association tells me I should be able to associate with a different government and with a different group of people and form my own organization. John Locke, Rawls, or not Rawls, sorry, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Hume, Rousseau, many other political theorists actually support this idea of secession, especially a right to like remedial secession. When a right is violated, a people have a right to leave that government. So like the American Revolution, it was argued that property rights were violated because money and taxes were being taken without any representation in the government. And so a new government needs to be formed in which people are represented and their rights are respected. Hence the American Revolution. Uh, there becomes a lot of grave concerns about the rights, though, of people. Again, like I said before, what do we do with the rights of minority populations in the countries that did secede? One of the justifications that Lincoln had for the Civil War was that during secession, the rights of those who were not a party to secession were being violated. The rights of the whole Union were being violated by secession. There are more nuances to that argument, but it's a very simplistic way to basically say that Lincoln justified the Civil War by saying secession violated the rights of all Americans. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. Supreme Court at the time kind of said it was. And secession, even to this day, is kind of still illegal in the United States unless Congress gives authority and grants legitimacy to the secessionist movement, which still would be a democratic justification that secession can't exist. It just has to be democratically authorized. Would countries, though, want to do that? That's a question that we'll get to in another minute or two. Let's also talk about secession, though, in terms of autonomy. If I join an organization, I should also have a right to leave an organization. Kantian arguments on autonomy would say that governments are not infallible and I don't have to follow a government that is doing bad things. In this way, secession is justified under autonomy. If I don't agree with my government, I don't have to follow my government. This becomes a very dangerous road and a slippery slope down to anarchy. And many of the arguments against secession are actually slippery slope arguments like this that basically say that if you justify secession of a people, then you also justify secession of all the subsets of the people. And like I said before, we can start defining people down into smaller and smaller subsets. We get into a world of anarchy. And then anarchy may be bad, and we can make arguments all about anarchy bad and enjoy the slippery slope that is debate. More pressing, though, are the security and stability concerns when it comes to secession. For example, what happens if California secedes? What does that do to the US economy? What does it do to US security situations? Because now we have this whole new giant border that we have with many different border crossings that we probably have to protect. Uh, what do we do with the military assets? Another reason why the Civil War occurred again, well, not again, let's actually break this down really quickly. The root cause of the Civil War is obviously slavery. Anybody who tells you different is lying to you. But we can start going off onto different branches from slavery. They're all going to come back down to slavery in the end, but there were other things that were little sparks that lit the powder keg here. And one of them was about military property and territory. Lincoln refused to give up federal property in the southern states. Again, the South seceded because of slavery. And Lincoln then said, we're not giving up our territory. So, like Fort Sumter, that's still ours. All of the military facilities, the naval ports, all of those are still ours. Those aren't yours. The South said, nope, Fort Sumter is ours now. And so, after seceding over slavery, the first shots were fired over federal property. That's a very important thing to note because federal property would happen in any type of secession. How we would get rid of this property and how we would kind of, break it up and compensation for it, that's all things that can start conflicts. What happens, with China, and if China sees the United States breaking apart or Russia sees the United States breaking apart? Wouldn't that probably embolden some of our enemies to become a little bit more aggressive? We could probably see China maybe lash out in different areas. There are a lot of different scenarios of what would happen if the United States somehow starts to break apart because of secession. Similarly, in Europe, there are similar scenarios. Also, with Russia, there are scenarios that you can talk about. Whether or not Russia would qualify as a democracy is questionable. But again, remember the topic is dealing with democracies. If we want to define illegitimate democracies as still a form of democracy, well, maybe Russia qualifies. I don't know. Uh, Finally, let's look at a little bit more of those like or stability concerns on a global scale. I already mentioned some war ideas with United States breaking apart, but what happens within Europe, for example? You have a lot of different trade deals. Some people have called Brexit a form of secession because they left the European Union. Well, the European Union wasn't a fully controlling government. It was still a form of international governance. And we saw some disastrous effects there. You could see some effects across Africa and secession movements across Africa. But again, many of those may actually be more positive effects in which countries gain some self-determination rights. So we'd have to ask about those safety and security concerns. Several authors talk about the fact that both countries post-secession need to be legitimate and stable societies in order for secession to be a legitimate right. And so, in that manner, you need to be able to prove that security and stability can be maintained post secession, and that really all that happens is that national expression and self determination are upheld. And that may be a very hard barrier for affirmatives to meet. And negatives, this is probably a really good strategy for you to go for, is that in order for secession to be a legitimate democratic right, safety, security, stability, and the rights of minorities needs to be upheld. And giving that four necessary but insufficient burdens functionally, that the AF must meet in order for it to be legitimate. And if any one of those is not met, it's not legitimate. So let's talk about quickly a couple of these secession movements. I've mentioned this region a few times, but Spain and France both have populations of Basque people, and the Basque region borders basically is the border of both countries. There are many similarities within both countries and how they deal with the Basque people. Generally speaking, there is some regional autonomy that's granted, but the Basque people in both areas see themselves distinctly as culturally distinct, have distinct histories, and there is a considerable amount of Basque nationalism, especially in Spain, there is a Basque nationalist soccer team. There's also a Catalonian soccer team. Uh, there are several different localized regional soccer teams kind of in Spain to give more national expression to regional areas. Both Spain and France also have given regional governments more control in certain areas to deal with the national expressionist movements, so that the regions stay within the governments, but they are given more regional autonomy and more regional control. Spain and France also have significant numbers of overseas islands territories. One of them is the Canary Islands, which Spain owns. And within the Canary Islands, there's been a history of nationalist movements, including ones that have included some terroristic violence against the Spanish. But again, those movements are kind of like they're not really, very big at the moment, but there is literature on them about self-determination and the rights of those people. Same thing with France. France has a couple of different overseas islands territories that have historically supported either secession or separation from France. These would be debates about whether they're anti-colonial movements or they're secessionist movements, or if there really is, you know, they're just trying to make a distinction without difference here between those types of movements. Notably, some of the British overseas territories, especially the ones that are like called Commonwealth territories or Crown territories, while they may be part of the Crown, they have uh, international recognition as, individual states free from the British from the British Crown, and stuff like that. But then there are other ones that are really British controlled overseas territories, like the British Virgin Islands, and the British the Falklands, rather, is what I'm thinking of. And those territories are much more controlled directly from the UK itself. But especially in the case of the Falklands, there have been several different votes and polling and stuff, and the population of the Falklands do not want to leave the UK. Moreover, they don't want to join Argentina and they don't want to become independent. So the British have a little bit different of an overseas situation than maybe the French or the Spanish. The Kurdish people, like I said before, exist in Iran, Turkey, and Syria. There is the, autonomous Kurdistan region inside of Iraq. The Kurdish people have been fighting for independence and recognition for a very long time. That fight actually is one that splits NATO, because the U.S. supports Kurdish fighters inside of Syria and Iraq, and Turkey basically supports the Syrian government and has had struck the Kurdish peoples in Iraq and Syria and also in their own lands. The Kurdish people's fight for national expression is one that always comes up with secessionist movements and national expression movements, and it's one that is vastly, or not vastly, but it's one that is just it's ongoing and it's been going on for a long time, and it doesn't look like there's going to be much to change there. Palestinian movements could also be considered secessionist movements, or I would actually probably define them more as an anti-colonial nationalist movement, because I wouldn't necessarily say it's the first expression of nationalism for their people, but it's an expression of nationalism for a people that existed in the region before the establishment of the state of Israel. And so there's definitely some discussion there that can exist. But that is one of those hot button topic issues that if debaters maybe want to take the safe route at nationals, I would avoid that discussion, because it triggers a lot of heavy feelings on the topic. And if you want, you can go back to a previous video topic analysis where I discussed actually this issue a little bit more in depth. But ultimately, that is a issue of secession and whether or not Palestinian nationalism qualifies as a secessionist movement or whatever. It's one of the things that can be discussed on the topic because Israel claims itself as a democratic nation. And should this right exist within the democracy? And then whether or not secession for the Palestinian people is legitimate because of security and stability concerns becomes a whole other question. Uh, there's also, like we said before, Scottish nationalist movement in which people in Scotland would like to see themselves separated from Great Britain. A lot of this comes out because of the Brexit movement in which the UK left the EU, and the Scottish people really didn't want that. The people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU, while the rest of the country did not. And so that becomes a bigger issue on in Scotland in connections to national organ or international bodies and stuff like that. And the fact that the Scottish nationalist movement is one that is very close to gaining that threshold of a Democratic majority support for its movement. And then we'd really have to see what it would result with the rights. But there's a lot of writing on the Scottish nationalist movement and how a independent Scotland would function. And that's good reading for any debater to go through to understand how a democratic process of secession could work, could look like, and could support the affirmative. In America, we have movements in Texas, California, Florida, that are all movements to want to leave the United States. I believe there's also movements probably in New York. Wouldn't be shocked if there are movements in almost every state in the United States that exist on the fringe of both the left and the right on leaving the federal government. But the big ones are really in Texas and California for leaving the federal government. Those are also the two biggest states that probably could exist without the US federal government. Florida and New York probably follow right after those two. But those movements are not as big. There was once a movement in the Florida Keys for the establishment of the Conch Republic. The seriousness of that movement is kind of doubtful, but it was a real movement. There were people that would fly the flags of it. And if you go down to the Florida Keys, you can still see the Conch Republic flags. Currently in Eastern Washington, like I mentioned previously, Eastern Washington would like to leave the state and join Idaho. Whether or not that qualifies as a secessionist movement depends on what literature you read and how they define it. Ultimately, there are many different secessionist movements around the world. There's a Wikipedia page devoted to it if you just want to get a list of different secessionist movements that you can start going down and then going into deeper research on different secessionist movements if you want to go that route. But there's also plenty of justification under classic political philosophy from philosophers like Locke and Hobbes, Rousseau, Hume, Rawls, thinkers on democracy and the social contract that talk about how secession could work, whether we have a right to secession. Again, looking at autonomy and free association rights is a great route to go. And then whether or not, I think making cases interesting, looking up some of those anti-colonial movements that may qualify as secession and being willing to defend that topically, that these are secessionist movements and, there are distinctions without difference between them. Ultimately, when you go to nationals, I hope that you have fun, you learn something, and you get to engage in some interesting and educational debates, and you meet some people and make some friends from around the country that you wouldn't have had the opportunity to if you didn't get to go to nationals. This is a great tournament. Good luck to you all, and I look forward to seeing you next year.